Okay, we should probably get started. I assume everyone can hear me okay. So I'd just like to welcome everyone here this evening. Especially nice to see everybody here in person, especially to see so many colleagues and students here. I'd also like to welcome everybody who's joining online. I'd also like to welcome Anthony Smith, the Vice Provost at UCL, for joining us here tonight as well. We're very grateful for the very distinguished set of speakers we have who have agreed to share their ideas with us this evening. This event marks the formal launch of the James and Kathleen Stone Centre on Wealth Concentration, Inequality and the Economy at UCL. We now transition from our inception phase to a 7-year programme of work. Wendy's often described the Stone Centre at UCL as a startup. Hopefully that means we will embody an entrepreneurial spirit in supporting new approaches and ideas and research and core-led education for understanding the causes and consequences of wealth concentration, a process occurring in many societies. Of course, the startup term is also apt given hugely important changes in labour markets we've witnessed over the last few decades, culminating in the rise of big tech and superstar firms, all at the same time as slowdowns in aggregate productivity, the increased scarcity of good jobs and meaningful work, and perhaps an increasing sense of uncertainty amongst individuals of what the future holds for themselves and for their families. Whether and how these changes relate to the concentration of wealth in society is clearly something the Centre will seek to understand. It goes without saying that the big danger we face as a society relates to whether an increased concentration of wealth is tied to a concentration of power, an ability to set the rules, shape policies, and weaken opportunities for others. Clearly, for such an agenda, we'll need to draw on research from all areas of economics, be they ideas in macro, applied micro, finance, issues related to the meaning and measurement of inequality, and developing theoretical frameworks that give us ways to separate causes and consequences, understand interlinkages between dimensions of inequality, and the dynamics of wealth accumulation. It's also part of our mission to work with and draw on knowledge from other disciplines. We cannot hope to understand processes of inequality without such a view. The economics of inequality cannot be decoupled from understanding what concerns individuals so much about inequality and the role that public policy can feasibly play to resolve these issues. Being based at UCL, London's global university, and having close-by partners such as 50-year-old IFS, 20-year-old CREAM, and the newborn UCL Policy Lab give us a tremendous opportunity to bring to bear research, education, and policy on the study of this great challenge. We're very grateful for Jim and Kathleen Stone for investing in UCL economics and believing in us. Before handing over to Jim Stone, who can't join us here today, but has prepared a video presentation explaining his motivation and concerns over the concentration of wealth in society, I just wanted to say a few words of thanks to the Stone core team at UCL, Jay, Luca, and Giacomo, who are here, whose amazing work throughout our inception period have got us to this point. It's almost exactly a year ago to this day when Wendy first sent me an email saying, we need to talk about something. At that time, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but one thing I've learned is that we have a fantastic team driving the whole project forward. I firmly believe that there is a need for economists to contribute to these issues, and that need is great. The stakes right now couldn't be higher, and at Stone UCL we have a great opportunity to bring together ideas and solutions for the common good. So we really hope everybody here who's participating in person or online joins us in that venture over the next few years. I'm going to hand over now to Jim Stone to say a few words.
I'm proud to be associated with University College London in the opening of this center. Let me explain why this funding is important to me. My wife and I have decided to commit most of our estates to supporting just 2 philanthropic causes. My wife's focus is environmental sustainability. My project is the creation of several dozen university centers on the causes and consequences of accelerating wealth inequality. The direction of my path was shaped when I first observed that some people are endowed with great hereditary status and wealth, while other souls, sometimes worthy or enabler, go hungry. The only human societies I've ever found attractive are those built around inclusive, pluralistic meritocracies with limits on excesses and generous safety nets for the unfortunate. In high school, I had faith that our society was bound for new peaks of distributional fairness. But economic equity in the United States has instead regressed. My country today has the highest Gini coefficient in its peer group, with the UK only a few lengths behind. If our countries were ever treading the path to equitable distribution, we have missed our turn. A related disappointment introduced itself at the Harvard Economics Department, where I earned my degrees. As a student, I was told that the field of economics could be divided into two subspecialties, equity and efficiency. I naively took this as a descriptor of two roughly equal branches. I was attracted to studying equity, until it became all too clear to me that almost no one on the faculty got there by writing about equity. Some will question whether disparities are really so bad, and whether incentives for creative entrepreneurship should ever be limited. I argue that there's no logical basis to believe that a laissez-faire market yields the optimal balance between incentives and equity. Among the many costs of inequities is the damage to our notions of justice. It is painful to imagine a society in which conspicuous consumption by the few provides an ever starker contrast with the lifestyles of the many. Another cost is incurred when members of the middle class feel pessimistic for their families' futures, and their sentiments and their votes turn away from generosity and compassion for those less fortunate. Consider next how financial disparities play out in criminal justice. Our two nations have built admirable judicial foundations, but growing disparities can only serve to erode our accomplishments. Excessive wealth concentration also inflicts direct economic damage. When too much wealth is locked in place over generations, resources supporting achievement will no longer flow equitably to those who can most effectively use them, and talent will thus be wasted. Nations, moreover, with extreme inequalities will likely be just as stingy towards essential social investments such as infrastructure and public education as toward aiding their disadvantaged. The most worrisome of threats, though, is to democracy. It's obvious that a degree of economic pluralism is a precondition for political democracy. The present struggles of the majority extend an invitation to bearers of aggressive, heroic promises who can seize the moment to turn us against one another. I can identify at least 4 reasons why wealth concentration is on the rise now. If given more time today, I could spend an hour discussing each. Instead, I'll just list them. One is the recent expansion of technology and knowledge-based employment markets that favor hiring the already privileged for the best compensated jobs and threaten to usher in a class or caste structure in which that many find themselves destined to work in humble service to the few. A second factor is globalization, which, like technology, is simultaneously a positive force and a driver of wealth concentration. The financialization of our economies is yet another factor. With nearly unlimited financial leverage multiplying market outcomes, modern bankers, traders, and corporate executives can claim rewards inexhaustibly greater than those who labor without those tools. Finally, we should not overlook a fourth accelerant, self-inflicted wounds from ill-constructed public policy. Some of these are acts of commission in the form of special interest legislation. Others are omissions, failures to create or employ regulatory protections. My personal blue ribbon for the worst public policy goes to the evisceration of the estate tax, the fairest and least economically disruptive of all taxes. If I knew how to strike the balance that best maintains incentives for innovative entrepreneurship while curbing excessive imbalances, I might concentrate on political action rather than academic centers. But I don't. The literature on how to find the sweet spot between the corner solutions, alas, is skimpy and vague. So our objective here is to help strengthen the needed intellectual foundation. I have faith that if adequate resources can only be made available, exploration by fine minds will produce salutary effects. Put another way, the goal of this initiative is to fulfill the promise of economics by concentrating as much attention on issues of equitable distribution as those of efficiency. That goal requires a career pipeline spanning undergraduate courses, graduate student stipends, postdoctorate positions, and the hiring of both junior and senior faculty members. If we encourage all disciplines, and not just economics, to join in examining the causes and consequences of wealth inequality, all the better. Let us all hope that over time a clearer intellectual roadmap can be developed, heralding a reversal of today's misguided trends while minding that the remedies are never worse than the malady. I'm thrilled that UCL is so enthusiastically joining us in commitment to that endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And just to introduce myself, I am Soumaya Keynes. I am the Britain economics editor at The Economist, and I will be taking us through this next section of the event. So Jim Heckman obviously needs no introduction, but as it is literally my only job, I will give you one. I'll try and make it brief. So Jim Heckman is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. He has won an extraordinarily intimidating number of prizes, including the Nobel in 2000 for his work on microeconometrics and selected samples. He is a champion of interdisciplinary work. His work covers topics including discrimination, skills formation, social mobility, inequality. He's published over 350 articles. I've been a journalist for, I think, 7 years, and I think that's more than me, so good going. And 9 books. That's a lot of books. Now, just a quick idea of format before I let Jim take it away. He's going to talk for around 40 minutes, at which point I will start looking really anxious, and then 45 minutes he'll wrap up. Yeah, I'll start pointing and heckling if it gets too bad. So then I'm hoping we'll have some time for questions. So do think of your most piercing questions for Jim. And yeah, with that instruction, I'm going to hand it over to Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. It's nice to meet a Keynes finally. I've never... We hear about Keynes all the time in Chicago, but not in such a nice way, so... Okay. Okay, well, I was invited today to talk about something that is of relevance to the center, and it really is in the form of some open questions. I don't want to pretend that I'm going to tell you something that I know completely. It's something that I'm working on and fascinated by, and I'd like to get the exchange. I would also point out that this is joint work with Rasmus Landerso at the Rockwell Foundation in Copenhagen. As an American, I've always been interested in the question of the success in terms of social mobility of the Danish welfare state. And in US politics, people, for example, like Bernie Sanders, and for that matter, Hillary Clinton, but many others have looked to Denmark as a model for what to do to promote social mobility. And so I said, okay, let me look at Denmark too, myself. So I'm looking at it, and I tried to understand what are the sources, what can we learn, and exactly how we can proceed. Oops, now I can't proceed. How do I point this? It's not advancing, so wait, I should be pointing it somewhere, but I'm not sure where. Underneath? Oh, point it towards the back of the room, okay. So the Scandinavian welfare state is basically regarded as a model, and I want to look into the model and understand sort of the working features of it and what we need to know and what I think is still unknown. So that's the issue today. What are the sources of its apparent success? Now, if you look, for example, at the success of Denmark, and you look at the cohorts, if you look at some of the work of Chetty and his co-authors about the way that the different cohorts in the U.S. have not done as well, recent cohorts, compared to previous cohorts, the Danish situation is different. The Danish cohorts are doing more or less the same as their parents. And I think that's fascinating. So why is that happening? Whoops, I better make sure I know. Oops, Okay. So this is the curve that's been referred to several times in the last few days. People talk about the Gatsby curve, so coined by Alan Kruger. But if you look at the lower circle, you can see that Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, are the model. This is from Miles Korak, who kind of originated collecting these studies. This is the Gini coefficient, and it's for after-tax and transfer incomes across countries, for families, by the way. This is family measure. These measures really do matter a lot. But what I'm looking at is the income of the parents and the income of the child, and that would also include something like averaging over the siblings of the family. So it's not a father-son, it's a parent-child, average child. And you can see that both in terms of the inequality, US and for that matter, UK, are higher up in this list. But if you look, for example, at the notion of social mobility, it's also the case that beta, which is the so-called IGE, which is the connection between the parents' incomes and the child's outcomes, and these are averages usually formed in the mid-30s, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But literally those things are suggesting that the intergenerational dependence is much stronger in the US and in the UK, and in fact in Latin America it's even stronger. So there's certainly an inequality beta statistical relationship. But it's been interpreted in multiple ways, and there's a huge and active literature on exactly which causes which. There's a recent paper, a fairly recent paper by Gary Becker, sort of the late Gary Becker, published 4 years after he died, but written clearly under his influence, in which he was sort of saying, well, the inequality, if you looked at the steady state of these income distributions, that the causality is from beta to the inequality in Y. And of course, the other notion is that there's inequality in outcomes because family influence is so strong. And so the question is, what do we know about this relationship? And what can we say and what do we learn from the current? So I think of Denmark as an ideal laboratory for understanding inequality and social mobility. And it's largely a good laboratory because it has such good data, and that's what attracted me. So it's true that in all the things they write about the Danish welfare state, that inequality aversion is very high in Denmark. And there's a tremendous, it's built in everywhere in the society. And I thought they would be useful to then look at just how this inequality aversion was implemented and to look at all the features of the Danish welfare state. So what I found was that some of the interpretations of the Danish welfare state that I used to use, and I think many people like Clinton and Sanders, and I don't want to just pick on politicians, many people used, I certainly used before I got into this study, was basically the notion that the services, the social service level in Denmark is very high. And so, for example, in the United States recently, the so-called Build Back Better bill that Biden was being pushed through Congress or attempted to be pushed through Congress was basically motivated. And many people made arguments about the success of Denmark. Certainly Sanders has used it repeatedly. So the question then is, what's interesting about it? This has many of the features that are in the Build Back Better bill. So this is why it was so interesting to look at it. Equality in services offered is mandated in Denmark. We know that there's universal health care and it's at a high quality level. We know, for example, that so these are all different in contrast to the US situation. We have teachers paid the same everywhere, except for cost of living adjustments. So a lot of the differential on payments and investments in schools would be different. And there's free daycare, and there's child care that's of high quality, that's offered from birth. So it's a very high quality, and then there's free college. So if you look at the bill, the Build Back Better bill, many of these features were central features of the Build Back Better bill. And the idea is that we could also create a welfare state that was as successful as Denmark. So we know that post-tax and transfers, income inequality is low, and intergenerational mobility is higher. That's what I just showed you with this curve. It's kind of bad. I should be looking at you, but instead I'm looking at these slides. Sorry, I'm not trying to avoid your faces, but I'm trying to look at my slides. And so the notion then is that basically, and this surprised me, and I'm still in the middle of investigating this, so that's why I'd love to get commentary, including very hostile commentary, so please. And that is that as we looked at the nature of the production of human capital, the free schools, the daycare, the number of features that were very remarkable, that intergenerational mobility is very similar in terms of things like education of the parents and education of the children, and in terms of many other dimensions about skill formation. And so that's the question as to how this happened and what was going on. And so we looked at this. And my Danish partners, by the way, were equally concerned. And we've kind of converged on this, although I don't have a firm explanation of this, and I'd love to get firmer evidence on this, is that we think that advantages from Denmark's universal access to services are really reaped more by the affluent. This is a case, there's something in the literature, it goes back to the scientific literature by Merton, Robert Merton, the sociologist, that, to those who have, more is given. It's a quotation from the book of Matthew in the Bible, which is, I guess, appropriate here in this service, in this building anyway. But to those who have, and so what's happened, I think, is very interesting, that the very universality may be some of the undoing or some of the creation of the inequality. And you add to that some evidence of strong sorting, and if anything, increasing sorting in the Danish economy. And so what we found in the Danish society, that the power of place is real, and I would argue, which is argued by Chetty and a number of other people. So and the whole literature and sociology by Robert Sampson and the like, it's a consequence of family sorting and family influence. So we know. But unlike Chetty and some of the work that's been done recently on this, I will argue and show you some evidence that families are purposely choosing neighborhoods. So it's family influence that's very strong. It's not just the neighborhood influence per se. And that there really is not random sorting, which is key to some of the identification strategies. But there is a lot of sorting, and the sorting on family background, on children, on education of parents and the like, has a very strong effect on intergenerational mobility. And this is a feature of a modern open society, a democratic society, unless we want to somehow prevent mobility and somehow prevent associations. So this, I think, leads, I'm going to argue, I'm going to show you this evidence suggesting that this leads to strong family income gradients. And interestingly enough, even though teachers are paid all the same, they more or less are sorting into more advantaged districts. And it's not they can offer higher salary. The only thing they can really offer is better students. And it's a kind of non-wage compensation. It's a point that's been made earlier, but it's interesting, it's so striking here in Denmark. So, the payment to teachers in terms of quality of students. So this is the argument I want to make, and you'll tell me when to stop making it. Lord Keynes, can I call you, I'll call you Keynes. I like the idea of working with the Keynes here. Tom Sargent would say the only Keynes I teach is spelled with a C, C-A-I-N, electrical engineer. Sorry. So the central premise of the welfare state is the equality of access. And I think if you read the original works, Max Weber on bureaucracy, if you look at the whole foundation of the modern welfare state, it's really equal treatment that's built into it. But what it's clear, and we've had a lot of evidence now across different pieces of evidence, and I'll show you some of it. Work by Walters, choice on many, many different pieces of evidence go together to point out that parents are often reinforcing what public services are delivered. They pick better neighborhoods, they enforce the delivery of services. So within every spectrum, even if you have an upper limit in terms of income, it's the more advantaged who generally are finding the more advantaged parents are finding their access to their children, better access for their children. My co-author, Landerso, as well as with Christian Carlson in Denmark, has shown that the universal access, which was made in education, increased when Denmark moved to universality instead of targeted programs towards disadvantaged individuals. This led to a greater dependence of child's educational status on affluence and endowment of parents. And so, of course, the housing market is free in Denmark, and that leads to a lot of sorting. And the sorting is in the form of neighborhood residence quality and so forth. You can look at the embodiment. People are paying higher prices for better schools, which is what happens in the US. But without any of the local public goods arguments made, this is really just the fact they are sorting. They know the peer effects are there, and they know the better teachers are coming there. And so this purposeless selection, I think, plays a really major role. I'll try to convince you. So what we can do is we can examine a lot of things, and we can also look at lifetime measures. So unlike a lot of the work on intergenerational mobility, we're looking at lifetime measures. So we're taking a full life cycle perspective. And what we're finding is, in terms of the economists who know this work, we're looking at what we call value functions, or some valuation of lifetime resources, valuing uncertainty, leisure, accounting also for credit constraints. And what we can also see is that there's a huge difference in looking at lifetime IGEs than just the kind of current measures of IGEs, which frequently are looked at with income based at the mid-30s. This is now a lifetime measure, and it turns out to make a difference and create much stronger dependence. So let me just evidence in the data. So I want to cover 4 points: inequality across the life cycle, the within-country differences, the educational mobility, and the intergenerational dependence and lifetime resources, okay? So let me just give you some idea of the similarity. This is one thing. Lance Lochner has done a lot of work. He and I at one time argued there were no credit constraints in the US. He built this graph on the left-hand side, and he showed that within each AFQT quartile, that's a measure of ability, if you looked at people in terms of income, those people who are farthest to the left within each quartile were the ones least likely to go to school. Now, for the very brightest, the top of the quartile, that's not a phenomenon. But across other quartiles, it's more or less the same. Now, if you look at Denmark for high school completion, it's not identical, but it's very similar. Very similar dependence, which kind of staggered me. It kind of surprised me. And even more surprising was this. If we look at cognitive test scores by parents' income rank, both in the US and in Denmark, the pattern is almost identical. It's not the same, but it shows a lot of relationship, which I found very, very interesting. I still find, and we're really trying to get to the bottom of it. And also what I found, I've done a lot of work looking at the importance of early years, and so that's why I started looking at Denmark, because they have such investments in early years, and they have a lot of emphasis on it. But then I said, well, what do we know about lifetime gaps between the advantaged and the disadvantaged? So we know what the US gaps are like. For example, if you look at mothers, it's one measure of status, of success, in terms of successful family backgrounds, advantaged family backgrounds. And so if you look, for example, at birth weight, you'll see, for example, that the top line is essentially then for the advantage, and the bottom is these dots are working in a natural order. So now we can go across the whole life cycle. So if we look, for example, at ages 3 to 5, the green lines, which again for the more advantaged, in almost every dimension, we can keep going. We can follow those people into 25, criminal activity, years of schooling, wage earnings at 40, whether or not they're in the workforce at 54, whether or not they're alive at 60. Those gaps are there. Now, that's in the US. What are the Danish counterparts? Take a look at it. Now, I know I could play tricks and change the scale, but I promise you they're roughly on the same scale. And really intend that we actually adjust this carefully to make sure that they're on the same scale. So in terms of comparable measures, you see the same kind of pattern about advantage and disadvantage. Remember, this is Denmark. And all these public services are equal. So if you look at incomes, you look, for example, at whether or not they're in the labor force and whether or not they're alive at 60. So you get a very similar pattern. And that kind of blew me out, to be honest. How could that be? So why do these gaps arise? I mean, this looks like something very strange is going on. And so what I want to argue is that actually when you look at the statistics, and this is a fact that I think maybe is known in Scandinavia, although my co-author has become famous in Denmark for this work. I'm totally unknown on this work, and so maybe some of you will get interested in it. But the fact of the matter is that it shocked a lot of the Danes, and it still is an open discussion in Denmark, that mostly it has to do with the fact that it's the tax and transfer system that's doing the job. It's not eliminating family influence. And that's very important. It means that, and this in some ways is a kind of a control that we have these very rich social economic policies which many Americans desire to emulate. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'm also saying they didn't quite deliver the goods yet. At least something needs to be done. So the greater mobility is due to the tax and transfer system, and that is really, to me, amazing. Now, the second, I think, major contributor is sorting by income and education. We know that there are peer effects. The peer effects literature is, controversial, but not as controversial as some would say, but nonetheless, there's some evidence of peer effects. And there's certainly a lot of sorting going on. So the old idea it takes a village to raise a child, and the advantage of peers in schools and peers in neighborhoods is real. So if you look, for example, at sorting. Oops, let me just see if I can go back. Yeah, okay, sorry. So the outcomes by family background are suggesting something else is going on. So what's going on? So if you look at schooling expenditure compared to the US, schooling expenditure is very similar. I mean, the Danish study, the Danish schooling data, this is across geographic regions, is very concentrated compared to the US, which is in some cases scandalous, the differences between rich and poor counties, even in the same state. Now, neighborhoods have received a lot of attention. We know Luchetti and his group and many others, Sampson in sociology, have received a lot of work about neighborhood effects, although without really specifying what is causing the neighborhood effect. And so the Atlas of Opportunity has been pushed heavily by the New York Times and a lot of policy proposals. In fact, there are a lot of moves suggesting we should now integrate or basically have mobility across neighborhoods to try to improve social mobility, move people to more affluent neighborhoods. And so we have this literature about the power of place. And we know, for example, if we look at the rank of a child, I'm just going to use the Chetty type measure, the income rank of the child and the income rank of the parent, we see this IGE, this beta RR, is basically just telling us how rank maps into rank in a regression context. And this is the Chetty map. You've seen versions of this all around. So the regions that are most mobile, by the way, if you look closely, you realize that the western part of Kansas and so forth, where farmers are leaving, but that's another whole story. There's a whole area here where there really is very low mobility compared to other regions with high mobility. And a lot's been made about that in the US discussion. But if you look at Denmark, you will also see a similar map. There's a lot of geography. And then we said, okay, look, the real question, and sorry to be too literal, I know there's a group of sophisticated economists here, but I'll draw some graphs anyway. Basically, this is one notion that's been taken, the power of place, location. You know, there's some magic about place, and Rob Sampson writes about the efficacy of neighborhoods. It's just like it's in the water or the air or something. That's a little mystical for me. We also think in terms of standard human capital models about parental traits. And of course, the real story is going to be something messy like this. And so the question really is the challenge of trying to sort these things out. And that's what we're trying to do. So the question is, what is going on at location? School quality, we have peers, and we have amenities. Now, we can measure school quality. The Danish data are perfect in this regard. We can actually measure not only the quality of the teacher by the test scores they had as undergraduates and as high school students themselves, the quality of peers in terms of their backgrounds and so forth, and various amenities. So we have a very good way to look at this. So let me just tell you what we think. So what do you think the sources? Well, here, this is too busy here. This is like saying everything works, so I won't say that. But the crucial thing is it's very important, is that parents pick neighborhoods. And I think that's very, very important. And I think if you look at the Gatsby curve, this is a version of the Gatsby curve taken from Chetty's work. This is 2014. And you can see then that, you know, it's showing something like the Gatsby curve for these commuting zones in the United States. And you can see this gradient. Well, what's the Danish version of it? There it is. Not the same. What? You think it's the same? Yeah, I think it's pretty similar anyway. So what do we know about the evidence effect? So we can then look at IGEs. So what we've been able to do, we can get down to the zip code level, we can get down to the block level. What's amazing about the Danish data is we can actually track people as they move from neighborhood to neighborhood. We know where they lived at every point in their lives, and this is kind of amazing. So we can use this, and we start looking at, well, let me just skip to the point here. If we look at the IGE, when we fit at neighborhood levels, and this is going to be at a very disaggregated level, these are at parish levels in Denmark. And it's good, again, it's parish level. It's Lutheran, though, so it doesn't work here. But nonetheless, if you see that the data without family controls, you'll see, is centered to the right, and the IGE is above 0. So there certainly is some dependence. When you put in the family controls, the whole distribution of the IGEs across parishes shifts to the left, suggesting much less You know, once I control for family, place is playing a much less prominent role. And we have a whole series of studies, and I'm not going to be able to go through them, but what we find is essentially that when we control for things like family selection, we do get very much weaker effects of neighborhood. And so it's family influence, but it's aspects of family, and I'll try to show aspects of neighborhood. So if you look, for example, at measures of neighborhood segregation in the US, one of the frequently remarked points about how the US is coming apart and becoming very segregated, this is the so-called tile index of segregation. And we can see that the crucial thing is that the curves are rising over time. So the United States is becoming more segregated in terms of things like income. And it's also true in terms of education. If you look, for example, at Denmark, you have a very similar pattern of segregation. So the neighborhoods are becoming much more segregated, much more homophily, much closer relationship. And we can give you all kinds of measures. So this is kind of maybe gilding the lily here, but we can do it by parish, small neighborhood, and large neighborhood. So we can get down to what would be small zip code type levels. And we can get the pattern. If you look between 1995 and 2015, you can see that in each one of these measures, we can see that segregation is actually increasing in each of these kinds of disaggregated neighbors. And if we look at things like mothers who are smoking during pregnancy, there's a huge amount of sorting by household across these different neighborhoods. Now we can also look at the question of sorting by teacher quality across neighborhoods. Teachers are paid the same. I already mentioned this non-price mechanism. So we can take a look at what the relationship is between parents' year of schooling and the average teacher quality. Remember, this is a measure that I can get of the teacher quality, the way they were performing in college and in high school. So we have a pretty good measure of the teacher quality. And we know the individual teachers in each school. So it's not like we're not making this up with crude aggregate statistics. And so we find a very strong sorting going on here. And it's interesting to me. And then this is even stronger in some sense. We can actually see average teacher quality and housing value. So parents are paying. And then we can actually say, so we can actually fit hedonic type regressions where we ask, well, how much are people paying? They're paying a lot in terms of their house. I won't go into the details of this. I don't have that much time. But we can look at how log housing prices fit in hedonic regression, and we find very strong payment for school quality. And then we can also then, because we have these lifetime measures, we can ask, how much do these lifetime measures translate into gains later on in the life of the children? And again, if you look at it, you see very strong effects in terms of college completion. We look at disposable income, employment, and the like. So this sorting, this cool quality is playing a very strong effect. Again, even though it's nominally equal on paper. So I will want to, am I doing okay on time? I'm okay, yeah. Tell me when I'm getting close. Okay, or getting boring, so either way. So the real question, though, and again, this is more of a technical issue, but if you look closely, and I had a long discussion of this at Princeton 4 years ago with Chetty. He never responded, so I can respond. I'll try to, at least in this case here, to lay out the point that I was making, but although we have much better data. What we look at is now the mobility choices of individuals in the schools, these school districts. Do they move at random, which is what the key identifying assumption is? And they don't. You can actually see a lot of purposive sorting into income neighborhoods, and you can do it by the nature of the school quality, by high school, the school of the parents, I should say, sorry, the average income, average education level of the parents. And so what you're seeing is that these decisions are made early on, there's low income early on, then they move to high income neighborhoods. But even more dramatic, let me just see, is the number of family moves. So you're moving very early on to the neighborhoods. You know, the point I made is people are ignoring school quality when they pick neighborhoods. That's the intrinsic assumption in those Chetty studies. And I said, well, I think you should ask some real estate agents of whether they're ignoring school quality and so forth. And of course they aren't. Parents are obsessed with this. And so you can actually see that once they settle into their neighborhoods, the most mobile people are the ones who are less than high school. More highly educated people are picking their neighborhood, they're high income. They may move, but they move, if anything, to a higher income, more affluent neighborhood with better peers in the sense of other people being highly educated. So this is, there's a lot of work, and we've done on this, showing this kind of purposive sorting plays a big role, and it influences the location choice. So most moves made by young parents are prior to starting school, and gaps in neighborhood quality remain and persist throughout adolescence. So family moves are not random. Now there's a real question that this raises, and there's been some work on this in Denmark. It's not mine, but I'm going to show it. The question is, can we actually, by busing or by changing children's neighborhoods, improve their condition? That's a big controversial issue going back 50 years ago in the US, and it's very much on topic now in Denmark. So the question is, should we have some forced reallocation, or voluntary reallocation? Forced is maybe too strong a term. So the question is, what do we know? Now the data on African American busing in the US is ambiguous, although you can see it here. This is some work by Rucker Johnson. He has a book on it. You can see there is some evidence, if you look at the top line, that after some busing to, quote, better schools, black children are doing a little bit better, a lot of variability in the line, more years of education, but it's not too sharp, actually. And if you look, for example, at this, court-ordered segregation, you'll see that on the adult family income of the children, it's a positive relationship, but it's not that strong. It just hasn't been that strong. Now, in Denmark, they've been doing this now, more recently. There's some studies. These are experiments. And they've been busing, in this case, children of Arabic origins, moving them to other neighborhoods, trying to get them in better schools, because the schools where the parents are living are somewhat disadvantaged neighborhoods, and so they're not getting these peer effects. And what's happened, at least by this work, by recent work, this is by Pildam, Matanya, and Nielsen at the University of Aarhus. Now what you see is the math test score went down and distress went up. I mean, what that means is the children show more. Now what's happening is these children are being relocated from their home neighborhoods into areas, and it's not maybe that the school couldn't improve their quality, but the actual policy caused them isolation socially. And it actually led to inferior performance. And so the issue was, it's not that in principle you couldn't improve the quality of the schools, but because I showed you earlier the quality of schools matter. But in fact, in this particular case, it was kind of a failure. And they have some more recent work, which they just finished it last week, so I didn't get it on these slides. So I would say the evidence on vouchers for mobility is mixed and contested. And so let me just talk about this educational mobility paper. I talked about this already, but here's an example of what's going on. And this may be an example of what in Chicago we call director's law. Arin Director was this influential economist, didn't write much, but he certainly influenced a lot of people. But the point is if you look at the amount of benefits spent on parents, children of more educated parents, you can see a huge gradient. And of course, it's because these kids are able to go to college. Everybody can go to college in principle, but everybody can't go in. Everybody doesn't want to go in. And so as a result, the welfare state is spending a tremendous amount on more affluent children. And it's not by design, it's by equal opportunity. You know, you pass the exam, you do this, and therefore what you're finding is that the benefits are not the same, even though they're intended to be the same. And the idea is equality before the law. So we can see Rasmus Landerso and Christian Carlson have actually done a very interesting study. You can look at educational mobility in Denmark going back to the 1910s, 1911s. Very rich, long data. And what you can see is during the period of the so this shows you the dependence of the father's parents' years of schooling, child's schooling on parents' years of schooling. And what you see is a very interesting pattern. The interesting pattern is that the IGE, if you will, for education was very high in the early years, then it went down, and then it started going back up. Now, what does that correspond to in terms of Danish policy? It turns out that in Danish policy, they were targeting the very rural, disadvantaged children living in Jutland, in one of the poorest areas. And that had a big effect in reducing the IGE. But then they switched over to universality as the welfare state tightened its rules, and that became more, the IGE started rising again. And the dimensions in the US and in Denmark are very similar in some sense. So we actually see very strong family dependence. And I've already made this point, so I won't go on. So I would say that universal access in education implies the public sector is dedicating expenditure to those who are more affluent. And it's, again, just this notion that even though we mean to equalize opportunity, that the parental environment is really causing a fundamental disequalization, which creates a challenge. It creates a challenge to a democratic state. Plato recognized this possibility. If you read The Republic, his suggestion for equality of opportunity was state orphanages. So we should take all children away from their families and put them in an orphanage. We've tried that actually in the US. It hasn't worked so well, at least for indigenous people and others. So what I will say is that inequality is actually, policies aimed at inequality in early education do have a form. So I would argue, for example, I don't want to be too enthusiastic, but I think there is work, for example, that suggests this. For example, Havnes and Mogstad, my colleague, show that the introduction of universal daycare in Norway had the biggest effects for the most disadvantaged. Dustman has a recent study about expansion of childcare in Germany. And what you find is an interesting pattern, which is the benefits are the greatest for the most disadvantaged. And that's what we all say. And you look at it. But among the disadvantaged eligible, it's the most advantaged parents who are taking it. So Walters finds that in his studies of Head Start. So there really is a sense of that, yes, we know where we can target things, but the question is, how do you lead that particular horse to the water? And how do you get the parents to be engaged? And this parental involvement and this notion of family influence plays a tremendous role. So let me just conclude with another dimension of this work, and then we can stop. And you got me a few more minutes, and okay, fine. Oh, very nice. Okay, I'm becoming a Keynesian now. So the traditional literature basically focuses on matching the income of father and the son. So if you look at almost all the measures, most of the CORAC measures, most all the measures looking at age 30, Chetty's like early 30, part of these are just data limitations. But here we can actually form life cycles. And unlike a lot of the literature, which is focused very narrowly, there's a whole literature about measurement error. We must, get income measured correctly. And we know that if you take short intervals versus long intervals, the long intervals average things out more than the short intervals. And so when Becker and Tomes wrote their paper originally about the greater mobility of the American labor economy, they were using one-year measures. And everybody pointed out that it was ridden with measurement error. And so literally they got a very low estimate of the IGE, but only because of the measurement error. And so literally we can now do better than that. We can look at lifetime measures, but we can also do something that's different, I think, from the literature. We have a whole paper on this, and I'll be happy to give that in another session if there is one. But literally what we can do then is think more broadly about what do we really think we're interested in IGE? What's changed over generations? It's not just that some group has more income than another. The whole society has changed. Women are getting more education. People are delaying childbearing. There's a whole onset of, so the age of marriage and cohabitation has changed a lot. Fertility has been delayed with female education and parents making decisions and on schooling, timing and spacing of births, and divorce. So there really are fundamental changes. And these represent part of the IGE, what should contribute to at least the measure of parental influence. So we start looking at measures of lifetime influence. And so we have one thing that's obvious is to simply do long-term measures of the current value, present value of income. The one thing we do, however, is we can then compute. We have a whole line of work, and I don't go into the detail, where we measure the information sets that agents have at the time fertility decisions are being made and at the time children are being raised. So we're looking at the lifetime income and we're discounting it. That's the standard present value measure. But what we also do is have a more general approach, and this actually turns out to be very fruitful empirically. So we're going to say, okay, people are risk averse. We've had, in the welfare state, has played a big role in reducing uncertainty in the economy. It's played a huge role in essentially giving lifetime resource lower bounds and things that weren't there before. There's also been a major change in the way credit markets have operated. So liquidity constraints have changed. And so we think that we should incorporate these aspects of insurance, changing credit markets, and changing expectations into. And so, in short, without going into too much of detail, what we try to do is use what we call expected lifetime wealth. And if you think about the value function, where you solve a lifetime social planners program, you solve the individual planners program, but you do it under the credit constraints, you do it under uncertainty, you do it with a lot of detail that is not normally accounted for, then we can form what we call expected lifetime wealth. And one way to see it is building on some early work by Lucas, and later work by Huggett and Kaplan, and later work by Gallipoli and others. So it's a whole group of work. So what we can do is instead of valuing income streams by just beta, this fixed beta, we estimate what finance economists and what most modern economists in doing financial economics would call the stochastic discount factor. And that would include things that include expectations, include adjustments for uncertainty, include the possibility of credit constraints. So that's what we're doing in this particular study. And so this is what the stochastic discount factor is. That requires us to take a position on information sets. We have a whole discussion about how we can determine what is known at the time agents are making their decisions, and then we can look at the difference between ex ante and ex post intergenerational measures. So we can only see what parents expected and then what actually happened. And so without getting into too many details in terms of lifetime wealth, I will just show you what goes on. If you look, for example, at a more traditional measure, whether you use family or individual. So in this case, looking at the father's son is the traditional measure. We're looking more at family child, average number of siblings. And what you see is if you look at the more traditional measures on the left, looking at wage income, looking at disposable income, you look at income trend, you can see that you're getting the standard notion of IGE. This is all Danish data, by the way. We took it for granted that it was Danish data. But what happens is you get these longer lifetime measures based on expected outcomes. You're getting much higher dependence in terms of the IGE. So if you look at lifetime welfare, which to me is a better measure of intergenerational dependence, you're getting much stronger effects. And you can do this for correlations, you can do it for a whole bunch of other estimates. But what we can actually say is which measures do better at predicting child outcomes. So it isn't just a matter of aligning incomes at age 30. It's a question of which of these measures are useful for predicting test scores, college completion, the things that we actually care about, not just, and what you can find, sorry, I skipped over this too quickly. What you can find is that these lifetime measures are far better predictors. And these are lifetime predictors at the time the child is in the home making the decision. So it's a recursive formulation. We can update it. So there really is more dependence than we thought. I thought it would be the other way around. And we can do the same thing for other things like years of schooling. We get a very similar pattern that when you use the lifetime measures of family income, including the credit constraints, adjustment for uncertainty, we do find a stronger predictive power of these lifetime measures, which makes perfect sense in sense of lifetime planning. So there's a much tighter link between parents and children than the snapshot measures that are currently used. You want me to finish? A couple more minutes. Okay, she's finishing me on. Okay, so what's interesting is that we can look at things like lifetime wealth, this value function measure really, and we can basically see that the IGE, in terms of the nonlinearity of it, we look at family background measures, looking at this is a local linear regression, non-parametric measure. It's much flatter in these lifetime wealth measures than we thought. And finally, in times of looking at what explains these lifetime measures, and without getting into much detail on all this, what we find is that education is explaining a huge difference. So even if you want to get into adjustments for family and fertility, just the simple, crude change of education across generations. Angus made this point, I remember a couple of years ago, he wanted to get interested in education when you were speaking at the seminar by Zoom, you and so here's an example where education is playing a powerful role, and it's actually explaining almost all the variation across cohorts in terms of fertility decisions and other decisions and marriage decisions. So anyway, if you look at the right, the expected PDV explanation, the IGE, that's the fraction of the IGE that's explained by these components. So education plays a big role. So let me summarize, okay? So I don't want to criticize the Danish welfare state. In fact, I find their data fascinating, and I find that they're... Well, no, the data are, but also it's an interesting case, though. I don't want to say this is a perfect... We're supposed to say we have a perfect... I know since Angus is here, he wants me to run an RCT and so forth. So this is as close as I can do to an RC. But seriously, there are a lot of features here that are just not present in the US data. And so I thought in some crude sense, we're able to control for a lot of factors that aren't there. And we still see this strong family influence. Now, I've told you it's sorting. And I've given you almost all the information on sorting. There's purposive choice of neighborhoods. There's planning of children. There's a lot of sorting going on. But even though these policies have been advocated widely in the U.S., uncritically, without nobody wanted to look at this study, by the way, so you're the first to see it, I guess. No, Denmark has seen it. But seriously, in terms of studies of Danish policy and evidence, that literally we actually find that there is a lot of social mobility. But it's all through tax and transfers. And this, I think, is important. We know that we can. Pre-tax and transfer, the IGs are pretty similar, actually, more than we like to admit. It's really fiscal policy that's playing the role. And these other features, at least in the Danish context, at least so far, even though this is the wish list at the very bottom, universal pre-K, equal pay for all school, leave for parents, universal free college, generous work leaves, these are all things that people wish we had in the US. I'm not saying we shouldn't have, but I'm saying they're here already, and we still find strong family influence. So the argument is not. So gaps in skills really reflect this kind of strong family sorting. And this sorting, I think, is also important to understand that family choice of neighborhoods is really explaining a lot the power of place. So it's not place. I've never understood place. Place is... People talk about neighborhood efficacy. There are certain neighborhoods are just endowed with something. Certainly some neighborhoods are better than others. But these family considerations are playing a major role. And sorting is playing a major role. And it's a challenge to promoting social mobility and economic opportunity. And it suggests we might want to think beyond this kind of crude, simplistic measures in doing so. So I've already given you some idea that a life cycle approach gives you a longer term perspective and surprisingly, more dependence across generations. And I found that, and the family's playing a huge role. So at the same time, I think we want to target. And so this is saying, contrary to the universal principle of the welfare state, targeting is probably a pretty good idea, or at least effectively targeting, whether or not you target. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jim. So Jim's very, very impressive, but getting through 128 slides in 45 minutes is perhaps the most impressive. Still, this is very impressive. Right, so there's a joke within The Economist, which is that pieces about international policy tend often just to be able, you can summarize them in one line, which is, why aren't we more like Scandinavia? And I think your talk slightly undermined that. Right. So I guess my first question, and I want to see a really big sea of hands from the audience, please, but while you're mustering up the courage to put up your hand, my first question is there anything good that the US should sort of learn or copy from Denmark, or is it all terrible?
Well, I think there should be an understanding. What I'm worried about is the policy. I think there should be a better understanding of which policies might be effective and the role of targeting. So I'm not saying there's nothing to learn from Denmark. There are a lot of very nice studies that are being done, like the busing study I mentioned. So the Danish social scientists are doing a lot of valuable work. But to me, it's interesting that we can then say, look, features of what we've been advocating have been tried, at least versions, and we might ask, how successful have they been? And the Danish themselves are now asking the question, well, what is it that still didn't quite go right? And I think that's an open question. I think that's an open question. So I'm not saying that, Denmark is evil or should be discarded or some sense, or the welfare state is bad. I'm not saying that. And you can see, I didn't show you all the effects, but if you look at the stochastic discount factors, when you look at the effect of these income transfer these programs that are essentially providing insurance and providing social insurance and providing a baseline insurance against downside risks, you can see real advantage in terms of these stochastic discount factors. There's real increase in welfare over generations, so I'm not denying any of that. So that's all there. But I think what many people have emphasized in the U.S. is just the skill formation aspect of it, looking only at education and inequality. I remember we had a debate at Chicago a few years ago. Piketty came to Chicago and the business school, Booth School, and Kevin Murphy and he were having a discussion. They didn't have a debate. They didn't even talk to each other. But if you look at Piketty's results, he found tremendous differences in inequality across countries. And of course, he was emphasizing some of the social tax and transfer systems, that this was a real source of inequality. Murphy was looking mostly at education, and this is a traditional skill notion. And so I'm not saying either was wrong, but I do believe that Piketty's emphasis on saying the institutional factors matter is without doubt important here. That really, the tax and transfer system is, and that the institutional factors are tax and transfer institutional factors that he was talking about, not the child care. So no, there were really nice things. The Danes are apparently the happiest people in the world, right? I don't know. Angus would know that. Are they the happiest? Okay, so they're the happiest people. But it's not because of this social mobility of their children in terms of their own background. And I think that, a lot of minutes. So.
Okay, questions? Lots of hands up. Okay, should we start with Jonathan? I think, yeah, I would just wait for the mic. Should we get a couple and then, or should we just, yeah, go for it.
Jonathan Portis from King's College London. Slightly puzzled by this sort of policy recommendation at the end of targeting, because I'm not sure you actually identified any really successful, at least at a sort of macro level, targeting-based policies. In fact, the only couple of examples you identified, I thought, were of universal childcare that had happened to have targeted or at least differential poor favoring impacts, which is a rather different thing from saying you should have targeted policies. What would the targeted policies look like in the context of education in particular? I mean, when I think of policies that have actually done something useful for social mobility in the UK, the improvement in the standard of the inequality reducing improvement in the standard of compulsory state education, particularly in London and particularly for poor children over the last 20 years, which has been an amazing achievement. But that is making a universal program work better and in a way that favors the middle classes and upper classes less. It's not a targeted program in the sense that I thought you were meaning.
Well, be careful. Some of the evidence I did show, maybe I skipped over it too quickly, was that targeting of educational transfers towards policy towards the more disadvantaged regions versus the universal policy of just equal access that occurred in the mid-50s and 60s in Denmark suggested that really did reduce social immobility, improve social mobility in that region, since the influence of the parents. But more generally, I'm not saying that there is a form of targeting. I cited Havnas and Mogstad. I cited the work by Walters and Klein and Walters and Dustman. And there are many programs where you do these micro evaluations and you find the program is the biggest gain found in these studies are for the disadvantaged kids. And that's found universally, even for the programs in the United States. That literally, if you just compute the gains, and of course they're the ones who are the most, they're the most challenged in many different dimensions. So from the U.S. data and from the data that was shown in Norway and the data on this child care program, I think it was in Germany that Dustman had, that basically you found that those disadvantaged, but even though those programs had the biggest effect for the most disadvantaged, it turned out that it wasn't the most disadvantaged who were using those programs. And we know that. There's this work that's been targeting, for example, college going in the United States. That we have these universal programs. We have affirmative action. We have open programs trying to get minorities and trying to get very disadvantaged children who parents aren't that well educated to apply to college and to apply to scholarships. They have a lot of difficulty navigating that system. And so the experiments have been run where people are getting assistance to actually make those kinds of applications, and they've had a big effect. So that's the kind of targeting I meant, that you would basically say, look, at the bottom end, we know that there's a strong parental influence, And we might want to do something about it to kind of remediate that and give them another avenue of access. That's the targeting I meant. I don't know. I think some of the evidence would show that. This paper I mentioned by myself and Alongo and some others surveyed a number of early childhood programs. And I think a universal finding, everybody would, not everybody would agree, but many would agree that some of the strongest effects have been found for the disadvantaged when these early childhood programs have been applied to the most disadvantaged. But the same is true, for example, in these mentoring programs. In the ghetto, for example, in Chicago, we have these charter schools that have gone in, and we've really targeted kids, and the targeting has taken the form. Remember, targeting is literally saying, okay, this child lacks a mentor or parent, and therefore we're going to try to supplement the life of that child. And they've been very effective at taking kids who are really at the bottom of a test score distribution and moving them to the center. And they're just getting parenting, and they're getting support, mentoring that's not. So that's the sense in which, maybe I haven't convinced you of that, but I can send you a batch of papers. So that's the sense of targeting that I think would be relevant. But it's more than just saying, this program is only for this person. Look, you could have a universal program. You can do the following trick, and this is what many people propose, that you basically say, okay, I'm going to make Head Start available for everybody, but on a sliding scale. So if you're making $1 million a year, you're going to pay a couple of $100,000 a year to use Head Start. So basically, it's universal, but with a fee. And that's the form of targeting that actually many people like. They don't like the idea of stigmatizing individuals. I understand that. But I think there's also a need to recognize that some people have more access than others. And this was true in the United States when the War on Poverty was set up. There were a lot of programs for poor people. And they weren't even aware of them. They were actually legal aid clinics were set up. And that's a sense of targeting that I mean. So providing information, providing support. That's all I'm saying. Okay. I don't know if that satisfies you, but maybe I never can, so.
Okay, great. So we've got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to ask two more questions at once, and this is an event generally about inequality, so please don't make me only ask questions of the dudes. Hello. So yeah, can I take 2 questions in one go? So, yeah, Rihanna. And then more hands, yep, and then, sure, the gentleman back there. Yep.
Okay. So essentially, we start from a very unequal situation, and we just give the same to an unequal distribution. You're summing the same constant to an unequal distribution, you get an unequal distribution. It's kind of sensible. So have you thought to what extent the difference comes from the wealth of the parents? Wealth, so that an estate tax could deal with?
That's
or
actually,
we're going to get another one, and they're going to ask them.
Or the education of the parents. Because effectively the kids, if the mother stays at home, the rich kids have education from morning to night by somebody with a college degree.
Okay. But when wait, let me finish. Let me answer. The lifetime wealth measure, I skipped over this, but we have measure of capital income. That's included. So when you write down the value function for the lifetime program for consumption investment in the child, that actually includes wealth, the measures of wealth that we have. Now, they're registered data measures, so it's not as rich as it could be if we had these wealth is very hard to measure, as we know. But we do have some measures of wealth in there, and they do make a difference, yes. And business income, it turns out entrepreneurs, children, are doing relatively well. We didn't break it out here, but the self-employed at a high level, children on the neck, they would pass their assets on through inheritance, but they would also pass their skills on through, transmission of the firm level and so forth. So we do find there's some notion of entrepreneurs being able to improve the well-being. So yes, for sure. But they're also sorting into those high-end neighborhoods, and so they're giving their kids all the advantages and then some.
Okay, great. At the beginning I said I had one job, which was to introduce Jim. Well, I lied. I actually have 2 jobs, and my second job is to make sure this little bit finishes on time. So I'm very, very sorry to everyone else who had their hands up. I'm sure there'll be time for more questions right at the end. But please join me in thanking Jim for a really fascinating talk.
Hello, and welcome to the second session. I don't know how we could possibly compete with that fantastic piece of social science. Always impressed by when I hear Jim speak, and today was no exception. So I'm very pleased to be part of this launch. I'm not really going to say almost anything, but I was very delighted when it started up by the fact that it was focusing on wealth inequality, because there's been a huge amount of work in economics on income inequality, on consumption inequality, to some extent constrained by data. There's been much less work on wealth inequality. And I'm not sure I want to say this for sure, but I could make a pretty good case that in many dimensions wealth inequality is actually more important than income inequality. And in particular, people who are worried about the effects of wealth inequality on political power, or the effects of inequality on political power, tend to worry much more about wealth inequality because it's so permanent, because it goes on for so long, than they worry about income inequality. And of course, it takes us back to the old days when social class was based on the ownership of wealth, the landed aristocracy and the rest of us being serfs and so on. So I think wealth inequality is one of these things that has a big effect on the structure of our lives. Now you might say, okay, you've been talking about serfs and aristocrats and so on, so what's this got to do with firms, which is what we're talking about today? Well, actually rather a lot. I mean, firms, of course, are the engines of wealth creation in the societies in which most of us live. That wealth is held either by the firms or by their owners. And the creation of wealth by these firms creates national wealth, but also creates enormous amount of wealth for individual people and for individual firms who have interests of their own. So in one sense, that's a good sense in which large amounts of wealth, we all want to be wealthier, and more wealth is good. But one of the things that seems to be happening, certainly in the UK and the US, and perhaps more generally, and the panelists will talk about that, is that firms are becoming much more unequal and have become much more unequal in recent years. So that you're getting these enormous firms, which are, and many, many more industries are dominated by very large firms than used to be the case. Now, then it gets difficult because there's the question as to whether that's a good thing or whether that's a bad thing. And that's one of the issues we're going to talk about on this panel. I mean, it could be a good thing if firms get to be big because they're very good at what they do, right? So if you're just much better at selling stuff than anyone else and you take over the retail space, that's really good because there's more for everybody. It's a real gain in efficiency. So, but even if you buy that, and not everybody buys that, because you might get big by bribing officials to let you get big, or you might get big by, crooked means of one sort or another. But even if you get big because of good things, because of benefiting people, there are dangers there. And one of them is political power. One of the things I like to quote that's in Ann and Mai's book, there are more lobbyists in Washington now from Google than there are from all the trade unions put together. That didn't used to be the case, and it's a pretty fair measure of political power of unions versus firms. So these firms can have political power. They can also have a lot of market power, and that's become a huge issue again, whether they're overcharging to consumers because they're so big and they've beaten all the competition, or whether they're paying their workers too little because once again they're dominant in the market and people will accept below market wages. So the real question about this expanding wealth inequality, is it a sign that the world is getting a better place, or is it a sign that we're just sacrificial victims to plutocrats who are ripping us off? okay? That's perhaps too sharp a distinction. And both of them could be true at the same time. You know, is this inequality good for us, or does it mean that we're being robbed, or that we're being set up to be robbed sometimes in the future, which is a possibility. So I have some very distinguished people here who are going to help us get to the answer of that question. John van Reenen, on my left, has done an enormous amount of good recent work on firms, and I think of him as the sort of firm expert. Arin Dube here has done very highly regarded, wonderful work on the more labor side of this issue. Splendid work on minimum wages, topic that many of us thought no one dared write a paper about anymore, but he's done that. And then Wendy Carlin here, who's been educating not just students, but the whole economics profession into taking economics in the world more seriously. So I'm going to ask each to talk for about 5 minutes. I will beat you over the head if you talk longer than that. And I have a big stick here for that purpose.
Carrot, Angus.
Well, the carrot is I will smile nicely when I'm happy. So, John, you start, and then Arin, and I'll let our co-director of the Stone Center go last. Have the final word. Thanks. It's yours, John.
Okay, well, thank you, Angus, and thanks very much. I'm delighted to be able to say a few words. I think this is a really fantastic initiative that Wendy and Imran are leading, and I really look forward to the kind of work they're doing. So I think I've got 5 minutes to be very brief. So I'm going to echo some of the themes that Angus has said. I wrote a chapter in the review that he has been leading over the last few years with Richard Blundell on thinking about what's been happening to the business landscape and firms, focusing on the UK, but also contrasting it with what's been happening in the United States and other countries. Thank you for the question. So, the first thing to notice is that, we have seen some very large macro changes in what's been happening to the business landscape over the last 30 or 40 years. So in the UK and in the US, but particularly in the UK, there's been a big slowdown of productivity growth. So it was growing, if you think about GDP per hour, that's a measure of productivity, it was growing by about 2.4% in the 3 decades leading up to the global financial crisis. But since then, it's fallen to about 0.2%. So it was tenfold as big in the previous years than it has been since the global financial crisis. And wages have followed in tandem, as we might expect as economists, with that change. So wages were growing pretty healthily prior to that, but have been stagnating and even falling since then. And that has been almost unprecedented in British history for many hundreds of years. Alongside that, we have had a growth of markups that firms are having, the prices over costs, and we've seen big increases of industrial concentration, as Angus mentioned. I think that last factor is important. So, take the US, for example. If you look at mega firms or superstar firms and define that, say, as firms employing more than 5,000 workers, in the mid-1980s, about 28% of workers worked in those firms, and that has risen to something like 34% on the latest numbers. That's a pretty substantial increase. And if you look at sales, which may be a better measure of the footprints of firms, think of Google, it actually employs relatively few workers compared to its sales footprints. The size has been even bigger. So if you look at measures of concentration, for example, and sales, those have risen by even more. Now, of course, inequality between firms is not the same as inequality between individuals or communities. We should care less, in some sense, about it. But there are a couple of reasons why we might care. So, yes, there may be these reallocation forces, which, by moving activity towards large and successful firms, as I said, are good. But there may be negative things. Some part of our wages and well-being depends on the firms we work for. So if inequality between firms has become more dispersed, this will be a force for inequality between workers. If the part of the slowdown of productivity growth might be because it's harder for the laggard firms to keep up with the leading firms, that is also an issue. Work that I've done with David Dorn and Larry Katz and David Alter has shown that if you look at these superstar firms, they earn pretty high price cost margins, pretty high profits. So as the weight of the economy has shifted towards these firms, it's been a force for actually pushing down the labour share of GDP in the United States. And finally, there's also the social and political concerns that Angus raised. Maybe these very large firms have lobbying power to shift the rules of the game. Now, some of these patterns are common across countries, but they don't all operate in the same way. So, for example, if you look at the labour share of GDP or national income, it's fallen a lot more in the US than it has in the UK. And I think one of the reasons for that is institutional reasons. So, for example, in the UK, unlike the US, there has been the introduction and strengthening of the minimum wage very substantially since 1999. And that has been a force, has been shown for reducing wage inequality, especially at the bottom end of the distribution, and probably as well, and this is kind of research in progress, for maybe serving to offset some of the forces pushing down the share of labour or of GDP. Finally, what should we do about this? What does this mean for policy? I would look at three things. And building a bit on what Jim said, I think human capital or skills is absolutely critical towards thinking about dealing with inequality at all levels, but particularly for people who miss out on going to university. So, I personally believe there's the so-called lost Einstein or lost Marie Curie effect. There's lots of very talented people who might be born into low-income backgrounds or backgrounds that don't get the same opportunities, that we could give them the chance to potentially become the innovators and entrepreneurs of the future. And this would be good both for inequality and also help improve the rate of innovation and productivity growth. I think there's also an important set of questions which we might get into around competition policy. So I think that needs to be radically reformed in the way that we think about dealing with this new, more winner-take-all kinds of world. And we need to think about how we regulate the digital monopolists or how we think about competition policy towards that. And more generally, we need to think about how, especially in this country, we need to deal with the slowdown of productivity. So both improving investments and also improving innovation. Okay, I think I'll end there, given my 5 minutes are up.
Thanks, that's great. And you're dead on time. Arin.
Where's the... I think it's on. Okay. Thank you. So economists have not always paid a lot of attention to the role of firms in some ways, or the idea that firms have some independent role beyond over being a, say, production function. But, in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years in particular, there's been a lot of interest in trying to understand firms' decision-making on a variety of things. I think we heard some of those already. It's also been, it's more clearly recognized that part of the inequality in the US, for example, as well as other places that has happened, has been between firms. And in particular, there's some of that has to do with potentially choices that firms make, including whether to make things in-house or outsource it to other contractors. And as as research has shown, that some of those choices that firms make have pretty important impact on inequality. So this is particularly relevant right now as someone who studies the low-wage labor market. In the United States, speaking of firms' choices, firms are actually having a really hard time filling positions. This is what we call the Great Resignation, leading to some firms, especially those who pay particularly low wages to otherwise similar workers, to substantially raise wages. So we have seen very sharp increases in wages at the bottom. For the first time in the last 4 decades, we've seen a reduction in wage inequality, and the gradient of wage growth by percentile is actually exactly flipped. And this is for the first time that's happened. So it's a really interesting question to think about. What type of environment leads to firms making certain choices, and are those choices then particularly sticky? Do those last longer periods? Here I find it quite useful to compare, in the US context, the experiences of the two largest employers. One is Walmart and the other is Amazon. So the story of Walmart was that in the 80s and 90s, Walmart really spread and revolutionized the retail sector, but it also became the largest employer. So what was the impact of that firm? In some ways, does that make sense to think about choices that employers make? Well, Walmart originated in what's called a right-to-work environment, very strongly anti-union, and was able to, and has been able to, keep off any unionization attempts. Also, they were particularly ranking lower in the firm wage distribution. So number of work, but including some recent work by Justin Wiltshire, shows compellingly that when Walmart entered a local labor market, it did a few things. It lowered wages just by the fact that it was displacing somewhat higher wage jobs. Additionally, it increased concentration in the market, and that led to additional sort of more equilibrium impacts on wages. And as a result, this matters because this potentially has important implications for impacts of particular policies. Here's an interesting point. When you have certain degree of labor market power, the impact of policy, let's say like minimum wage, can be quite different. In fact, it can lead to even sometimes surprising lack of employment effect or even positive job loss as firms are actually bound by labor supply. So it turns out that, in fact, if you look at places after Walmart entry, the impact of the marginal impact of minimum wages actually flips sign, meaning minimum wages become particularly more effective at raising wages without causing job loss when after having seen the Walmart entry. So I think in general, the role of firms in the 80s and 90s in the United States at the time of growing inequality, relatively less tight labor markets, is actually probably really important to try to better understand. Then fast forward to something like 2014. In the last 7 years, we have seen a very different move in the retail sector. Today, almost every major retailer has voluntary minimum wages. For example, Walmart, it's $12, Amazon, it's $15 or more. This was absolutely a new phenomenon. The idea that companies would announce that they actually have some voluntary standard was unheard of. And yet, this has led to very important changes in both wages in these companies, but also, as Laura Duranencourt and other co-authors have shown, has spilled over to other firms. So these choices, starting with Amazon announcing a $15 path to $15 voluntary minimum wage, leading to major spillovers in wages across the labor market, the low-wage labor market, is quite important to try to better understand. So I think, going forward, what I think would be great to get a better handle on is what are the sort of overall economic and social forces that lead to some of these major business choices, which have very important implications for workers? So understanding, for example, where a particular vintage of labor relations emerges, and how is that related to things like macro environment or other social pressures, that seems a very important thing to better get handle on. And I think economists have paid increasing attention to some of these questions, which is actually quite encouraging, and I hope to see more some of you who are thinking about research to consider some of those ideas.
Thanks very much. That's just terrific. Now, Wendy.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here, and wonderful to see such a lot of people interested in what we're hoping to get to work on. So I thought a place I'd start, just as Angus introduced me, was to start with what we've been doing in the core project, and the core project is a big chunk of what the Stone Center is going to be doing at UCL. And to really just begin by thinking about where we begin with a model of the economy when we're trying to introduce students to economics. So why do we call the first unit, the first chapter of Core's textbook, The Economy, why do we call it the capitalist revolution? Well, that's a good. Okay, I'm not getting many answers, but so we could call it something like the market economy, but we don't. The point is to bring students from the really existing economy in which they live to economics, and to show them the power of economics to help them understand some of the really big challenges that we face. So what's the difference between a market economy and a capitalist economy? Well, the capitalist economy has three main elements: the market, private property, private ownership of tangible and intangible capital goods, and firms, just as Arin and John have been telling us about, and Angus, in fact. So what is it about firms in a capitalist economy? Well, the employment relationship is central to the firm. The owners employ the workers, they have authority over them, they pay wages. It turns out to be important that we think about the economy from this perspective, rather than the perspective that was that you can find in a prominent textbook in the 1960s that said one could call the employee the boss because he orders the employer to pay him a specific sum if he wants services performed. Okay? But words are words. Right, so that's not how the economy in which we live works. So what we do is we begin with a model that places both firms and wealth or endowments at the centre, and we focus on outcomes in terms of both dynamism and distributive justice. So I wanted just to try to turn the conversation a little bit to the connection between wealth concentration, risk-taking, and innovation, which we haven't really touched on so far. But perhaps it connects with what Angus was suggesting in terms of the importance of thinking not only about income inequality, but also about wealth. So what is it about wealth? What's different about wealth from income inequality? Wealth is, those with wealth are more able to bear risk and to engage in risky ventures from the very small scale, like moving to a different location or learning a new occupation, to the larger scale, like founding a business. And the insights that come from Schumpeter give us if we're trying to think about the dynamism, what is it that's caused all of or produced all the innovation in that we've experienced over the past decades in the IT revolution? There's the incentive that Schumpeter pointed to of innovation rents. So if you're able to participate in the innovation club, and we know that membership of that is a rather exclusive one, if you're able to bear those risks, if you're able to overcome the kind of credit constraints that Jim Heckman was referring to, then you get innovation. But we also know from a lot of research, part of it stimulated by work of Philippe Aguillon and Peter Howitt, that, and empirical work done by Richard Blundell and others, and John, many others I could mention, the papers always have an extremely long list of authors. But that the pressure to continue to innovate depends on there being sufficient competition from new entrants. So otherwise, the countervailing incentive is there to protect, to use lobbying to protect those rents. That wins out and innovation falls and inequality becomes entrenched. Okay, so I think it's really important that we have this dynamic idea of the connection between wealth concentration, risk-bearing, and innovation. Jim Stone, in his introductory comments, pointed to this kind of sweet spot that we're looking for, which is how do we create incentives for innovation, but not produce entrenched wealth concentration. And that's, I think, one of the things that we'll be really trying to work on in the research that we develop. I want to just make one more remark because I think I'm exhausting my allocated time. And this is something else that I think that economists have really not spent enough time working on, but that connects up some of the dots. And this is housing. Some people have now started to work on, I think housing is important for stability when we're thinking in the context of financial cycles. But what about housing as a conduit through which other policies affect wealth concentration? And why am I concentrating on housing? Well, for many people, housing is the only credit. So credit for housing is their only access to credit, and housing is the only collateral they have, which is then the only basis they have to enter the innovation game. So I think we need to understand much better, and Piketty's initial work, although he never really highlighted it, was about the extent to which wealth concentration was associated with housing, not with, and in particular, capital appreciation in housing. And of all the forms of wealth concentration, that is certainly not one that has rewarded innovation or risk-taking. So I think that's another kind of marker that we should put down and say that we need to think about, we need to work on the origins of wealth concentration and their consequences for the ability of people to bear risk and to engage in innovation. I think there are interesting things to pursue. There are innovative ways of thinking about insurance, different insurance mechanisms in relation to house prices that could help to reduce volatility and enable more people to bear risk and to engage in the kinds of innovation that would then produce real mobility through the wealth as well as the income distribution. So I don't think it's all about education. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Wendy. Well, I thought firms were really important at the beginning of this session. I now lots of things that I hadn't thought about and avenues, and I do think we may have spent too little time thinking about firms as a sort of just way of organizing a whole bunch of things that are really important to us right now. We have 15 minutes. And I'm happy to take questions from the floor. Yeah, please.
Hi, Richard Davis from the Economics Observatory. Wendy, in your definition of capitalism, I thought you were going to mention the ownership of firms, and certainly in British capitalism, the Joint Stock Ownership Act, the 1820s, so that everybody could buy and own firms has been one of the most important things. And that leads me to a question for everyone in the panel. One of the economies, actually on Jim's slide, the most extreme ones, Chile, a country I know little about, has had a lot of rioting and a lot of anger against its model of capitalism. Some of that's to do with education, links to two talks actually. A huge amount of it is to do with the ownership of firms, an oligopolistic country in which private firms have come to control markets and a few families are seen to own them. So none of you mentioned the ownership of firms. Can we do more? John, should we be worried about the rise of the private firm? Should we do more to get the public, low-income public, through schemes to own more of these superstar firms, so that the benefit of the firm, which is making these excess returns, is more widely spread?
Wendy, you want to say something?
Well, I think the question was to John. But yes, I mean, I agree. I want to just to make one, concrete point about the way that concentrated ownership feeds through. So there's been some fascinating work done on the effect of QE. Okay, so this is a why am I randomly bringing in monetary policy and QE? Well, it turns out to be very interesting because we can see how QE has increased racial inequality in the US, and the channel is precisely through ownership. So this is work by Moritz Kuhn and collaborators. So just let me tell you what they found. I think it's extraordinarily striking. They found that the point of QE was to boost employment. Remember that time when we were all worried about deflation? So that was QE. And the idea was to boost employment, and that in fact happened. And through the earnings channel, blacks in the US benefited relative to whites by $97 per household. Okay. But the increase in share prices, so this is the question of who actually owns the firms. So share prices increased 5%, house prices 2%, produced capital gains for white households of $25,000. Remember the $97 that operated through the earnings channel, where all the attention was on the great success of the earnings channel. This was $25,000, which is a quarter of their annual income, as compared with $5,000 for black households. Okay, so that shows you how these differences in inequality are really important in understanding the transmission mechanism of something that might seem as anodyne as QE.
I should say, Richard, of course, has done lots of work in this area, and I'll mention a couple of related things. So one thing is that, one thing I didn't mention is that we've had a kind of decline of business dynamism in the UK as well as the US, in the sense that the kind of entrepreneurship rate, the kind of growth of firms, of people who employ other people, that rate of entrepreneurship seems to have declined over time. So there is an issue about that's contributed towards the slowdown of productivity. The area...
Sorry, can you just define it again? How you're defining entrepreneurship?
Yes, I'm going to exactly say that.
Sorry.
You can think of two types of entrepreneurship. You can think of firms where people employ other people, which is the classic way we think about entrepreneurship, founding firms employing other people. But we can also think of new firms called the so-called solo self-employed, where people don't employ other people. And it turns out in the UK, there's been this big increase of overall self-employment, which looks like entrepreneurship. But if you break that down, that increase has completely come from this so-called solo self-employed group. And this is work by Steve Machin in particular at LSE. And these solo self-employed people look a lot like unemployed people. They are on relatively low incomes. They go in and out of non-employment. So often people say the UK actually, and the flip side of the productivity slowdown is we have a very buoyant labour market. But it turns out a lot of the high employment rate we have appears to be due to this growth of these people in rather precarious jobs. So the gig economy would be an example of this. So I think that is actually an area to be worked on and thought about a lot, because it does relate to the firm dimension. One other thing, actually, when we talk about Chile, I was in Chile when those riots were happening. I was invited to give a talk at the University of Santiago. A friend of mine who's an economist picked me up, and we went downtown, and it was like burnt out buses. It was really a bad state, and it was related to inequality. People were angry at the state of inequality in Chile, and I think this was partly a ramification of that. I'm not convinced personally that, given the size of firms, that ownership per se is going to solve the problem, because of especially large firms in the side of the spectrum of such dispersed ownership. I think rather we have to think of mechanisms that empower workers more in the firms, those firms that they work for. And I think giving them shares, I'm nothing against that, and that would be great, and cooperatives are great, but I think we more have to think about institutions which, number one, give more representation, such as maybe workers on boards or things like that. Number two, give adequate protection to workers if they have collective bargaining. And number three, we have to think about how we can get in my view, a more long-term perspective in firms in terms of their investment decisions. I think one of the problems in the UK is that the excess financialization of a lot of firms leads to a very short-termist view, and that's one of the reasons for a low investment rate. So thinking about mechanisms to maybe have rights to vote in different decisions tied to the amount of time that you actually own shares in, for example, might be one way of creating a more long-termist perspective for investments which matter for the long term, like training, physical investments, and other forms.
Let me do another question from the very back.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm Anthony Costello. I'm not an economist. Interesting points about wealth concentration, and to me, wealth concentration in firms also mean carbon concentration. And we've failed miserably with carbon taxes. I think only 13% of all emissions are covered by carbon taxes. My question is, would a progressive approach to corporate taxation based on carbon footprint of firms be a better way both to solve wealth inequality but also solve the climate crisis?
Who wants to take that on?
I don't know.
It's possible. You think that concentration may actually help on the grounds that you're dealing with a smaller number of very big actors, but it's not clear that that's just a conjecture and you don't know where the distribution of carbon is. So I don't know either.
I mean, one thing to say, I mean, like, I hope the centre does think about climate change, because, I mean, I think, Wendy's point on innovation and the importance of innovation, I think, is right on the money. And in my view, there's three broad policies for you to think of for dealing with the climate emergency. So one is a carbon tax. Second is better regulation. And I think, carbon taxes, we're never going to get the levels we need. Regulation will help, will be insufficient. The only real way is through thinking about innovation, both at the frontier for more clean technology and also the spread of that technology more efficiently. So thinking about ways in which we can stimulate the diffusion and innovation of clean technology is in my view, the critical thing in having a chance to deal with the climate crisis. I think there's lots of ideas to be done around that: taxation, direct research supports, policies towards the type of people we're going to need to do this. So lots of industrial policy, lots of things to be discussed in that area.
And it's also clear that changes in preferences and green preferences, as it were, and therefore the ability of people to mobilize and in other words, the value of social movements seems to be very important in generating green innovation. And there's economists, this is actually, you might be surprised about this, but this is actually something that economists have worked on and have provided some rather clear empirical results suggesting that you can get substantial shifts from brown to green innovation in the automobile industry when preferences change in a green direction on a scale that's similar to very substantial oil price increases. So, that element is has to be added to, I think, to John's trio of policy measures.
Yeah, yes, the question there, please.
Hi, thanks, Carsten Jung from IPPR. So when it comes to wealth concentration, Piketty has, of course, put capital taxation front and center for tackling it, just saying high rates of return and wealth inequality beget more wealth concentration. So I'm curious how you would, also in the research program for the center, what's the pecking order of policy tools that will be most effective? So, are taxes number 1, 2, and 3? Or is number 2 changing firm dynamics and innovation dynamics? Thank you.
That's yours.
Yeah, you have to come back and find out the answer to that. So that's exactly where we are. We're setting the agenda, and we want to encourage as much participation as possible. We don't know the answers to these questions. What we're trying to do is to identify the questions, the most important questions, and there's always a trade-off between how important the question is and how doable is the research. And as Jim pointed out, data is really key. So that's going to be something that we will have to work on.
Another issue that Wendy raised, and I wanted to respond to a little bit, was the effect of QE on wealth. And I think it's not just QE, because Britain had QE and America had QE, but the effects on the stock market were very different. I mean, there was this extraordinary explosion of wealth at the beginning of the pandemic. So, you know, here we all are. If you can remember 2 years ago, we think the world is coming to an end, and the stock market for a day or two looked like the world was going to go to an end, but then it started eating stuff, which turned it into this enormous spiral of wealth. And some of it was QE, but a lot of it was GAFA, was, you know, the fact that it was clear that everything remote was now worth a lot more than it had been before. So if you looked at the NASDAQ went up much faster than the S&P 500, for example. And there's an important issue here for the institutions that convert corporate wealth into private wealth are not unchangeable. So if you think what happened in the old days when most people worked for large firms and large firms promised defined benefit pensions, that had a very different effect on the distribution of wealth over people than when everybody had a 401k, for example. Because everyone invests their 401k differently. You know, there are people who decide it would be good to keep everything in treasury bills because the stock market is not for them. And also, you know, some people save and some people spend. So you just get this enormous powering up and, you know, this extraordinary explosion of wealth at a time when 1 million people are dying, which just seems like one of the worst things I've ever seen in my lifetime. Yes, here, please.
I have a question that is that the efforts against the wealth concentration are focused mainly in the US and Europe. How to repercute those efforts in order to improve the regulation schemes in the international affairs?
Did you hear that?
No. Especially in the labor matters, because there are a lot of efforts that are voluntary by a lot of firms, but how to make them mandatory in international jurisdictions.
So can you give an example?
For example, what was mentioned by Arin of Amazon, that they are improving the living wage, but where is it happening? Just in the North Globe, or is it happening as well in the Global South?
Yeah, so I think there's, I think absolutely trying to better understand how labor standards work in different contexts is critical, because of course the way it may work here in UK or in the US could be very different than how it works, say, in India or China or somewhere else. So I think there's increasing research on trying to better understand those questions, as well as, for example, how do these standards come about? So some of the standards, for instance, internationally have come about, for instance, from activism in the West. Like, for example, in the US, there's Students Against Sweatshops campaign to have collegiate apparel have certain types of labor standards. Did it work? Did it make a difference? Was it good or was it bad? There's some evidence that, actually that have to looked at to try to actually better tease that apart. Then there are things that are actually happening because of organizing, for example, for standards or political pressures in, the global South itself. And I think those would be very different. I think it's important to keep in mind that, there's a lot of surprising things that we learn about how firms set wages. And since you mentioned this, it turns out that if you have a multinational company that's based in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts raises its minimum wage, it turns out that company operating in Kenya or Uganda is likely to actually raise the minimum wage, versus if it's based in Louisiana, it's not. That's not something that we knew of until relatively recently, but then understanding these kind of spillovers across countries in firm practices, like how different are they when they're in country A versus B? And how appropriate are the practices to the local conditions? I think these are going to be really important things to better understand.
This is terrific. I think I've learned more in a couple of hours this afternoon than I have for several days before. One final round. Some of you know where I've been the last few days. One final round. John?
I was just going to pick up on Arin. So, I think we don't really understand firms very well as economists, as Wendy said. I mean, we often talk about markets, increasingly policy institutions, whereas actually having a good knowledge of the firm is something where there is like underground tradition in economics, but it's kind of come to the fore more in recent decades, both in wage setting and also in this more general sense in which practices get spread both nationally and internationally across different boundaries, whether it's management practices or productivity or many other technologies. So I think that is a very exciting research agenda. I find one note of caution. I think although we hope that firms behave better, and there may be ways we can influence firms to behave better, we can't pretend we can outsource everything to firms. So Davos is going, and there's this illusion of the Davos illusion, which is somehow getting firms to behave better will be the solution to the problems. Now, I want firms to behave better. I'd rather they spend, 10 million giving money to solve climate change than to Donald Trump's re-election campaign. But the only real way I think we can effectively have change is through a kind of political collective action to have the type of institutions, policies, and regulations we need in order to deliver what we want on inequality and other kind of public goods. So the idea we can completely outsource that to firms themselves is, I think, an illusion.
Arin?
Yeah, I was actually just going to echo even further, saying, in fact, some of those firm practices, right, in fact, are endogenous. They emerge differently depending on that political climate that, requires more participation. And this is sort of going back to what I began with. So to better understand, to use a more technical term, where do firm effects come from? Where, when we talk about firm effects, for instance, in the sense of understanding the role of firms in wages, but similarly, it's interesting, the fact that, you've seen, for the first time in the United States, there's a major company that has seen significant unionization, and that is Starbucks. I don't think it's accidental that Starbucks originated in Seattle, where I actually grew up. And it's a very different environment than, for example, Bentonville, Arkansas, where Walmart originated. And so even though neither company is particularly interested in having union representation, the extent of opposition or who is able to actually organize could be quite different. So I think the understanding how that environment plays a role in shaping business practices in a variety of dimensions, not just on wages, but also on innovation, productivity, et cetera, is a very exciting research frontier.
Wendy?
One quick word. I would just say that what John's highlighted is that we can't just focus on firms, so we have to think about policy state actors, and Angus really emphasized political power. I would like to expand that space so that we shouldn't just be talking along this one-dimensional continuum between market at one end and the state at the other, but we have to bring in this third dimension. I've already mentioned it once, but let me mention it again, which is civil society, where we have different motivations and we have different ways of implementing allocations, ways that include the exercise of private power, which we've talked about here, which don't fit along this market-state continuum, and also the role of social norms. So we've got to have this richer framework if we're going to think about how we're going to confront the problems we face: climate change, inequality, and I would also add the future of work. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. I would like to end with an even bigger picture issue, in case you haven't bitten off enough already. Some of you may remember ex-Senator Phil Gramm from Texas, incredibly articulate, right-wing, dangerous person. He had an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think, yesterday, which said the idea of stakeholder capitalism is a frontal attack on the Enlightenment, no less. So perhaps you could preserve the Enlightenment for us. Thank you very much. This was terrific.
Okay, so thank you Thank you very much, everyone. Just one final thing to do. I just wanted to invite Janet Gornick, who's the director of the Stone Center at CUNY in New York, to say a few words. So, Janet.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much. I'll be brief. I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to share with you a little bit about the evolution of this set of stone centers that Jim spoke about earlier and offer a glimpse of where we're going, I think, in the future. So let me just step back to 2014. I had the opportunity to meet Jim Stone. I went to meet with him in his office in Boston. We had a long conversation about income inequality and his particularly strong concern of wealth inequality and the institutions that shape both high and rising inequality. And that was the beginning of a multi-year conversation. I think more memorably on that day, he spoke about sort of I think at the time, mostly a vision and a dream about helping to launch a set of centers for the study of inequality, especially wealth inequality, but also to help reshape the profession. So I think it's fair to say it was really mostly a dream and a vision. I hope he would say the same. But here we are 8 years later, and it's really quite remarkable what they have built and what's been achieved. So just briefly, I'll tell you that throughout the second half of the 2010s, Jim, with Kathy at his side, supported and launched 5 inequality centers. The first 3 were Harvard and Brown in the United States and INSEAD in France. And the 4th one was ours at the Graduate Center, which is the doctoral granting campus of CUNY, the City University of New York. And I just want to take a moment to say that when their gift was given to CUNY, it was really an extraordinary moment for us there. I think, and my colleagues in the leadership of the university were quite excited. Of course, we were very happy to have resources to build capacity for teaching and research on inequality, but also it was seen as a signal, I think it was a signal of confidence in our large, urban, public, and immensely under-resourced university, one whose official mission is to raise intergenerational mobility and decrease inequality in the city of New York. And so it was really, we thought, and I still think, an excellent marriage of scholarship with the mission of the university, and I think that was something that Jim and Kathy came to really prize. The 5th center was formed just after us, and that was Berkeley. I might add another public university. That's my song to sing. And then we moved into, I guess, what we might think of as phase 2. The 6th center was named here at UCL, the Stone Center. And I know that Jim and Kathy and many others are extremely thrilled because of the embeddedness of the core project here. Because, again, Jim talked a lot about a dream, which I think I know would sound lofty, but maybe less so now that they've done this, and that would be to help reshape economics pedagogy. And so where better, and how there's no better way to do that. So the 7th center then was named at the University of Michigan in the United States, also headed by a remarkable team. It has great progress, great promise. They're moving into a big study of wealth mobility. So here we are, really, after, I guess it's 8 years later, again, as I said, since I first heard of this idea about building a set of centers. And now we're really at, I think, an exciting stage, reaching various periods of maturation, and now we're beginning to talk about synergies and collaborations across the centers, which I think is really exciting. I happened to speak yesterday for almost an hour to Margaret Weir at Brown. We began to envision a joint conference on wealth inequality and democracy. I had a wonderful long meeting with Wendy today and talked about a contribution that our center might make on wealth inequality across countries and over time to the core project. So that's where we are. I'm immensely grateful to be part of this endeavor, and I'm really looking forward to the next phase of more growth and maturation and innovative collaboration, and we hope many of you will come along on the ride.
Thank you very much. So, thanks, Janet. We've already started collaborating with the other Stone Centers. We're hoping to have PhD swaps, exchanges, lots of visitors. Hoping to have some of you, I can see some students here involved in all of that. But I think I'm just going to stop here. I think we can say that this Stone Center is now officially launched. And I hope you'll join us for a drink next door, and you can look over the beautiful Dean's Yard and enjoy the surroundings here in Church House. And thanks again, Angus and Jim.